Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Tuesday, the 9th of July in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, the White House scrambles to quell concerns about multiple visits by a Parkinson's expert.
NATO allies gather in Washington as Russia presses its advantage in Ukraine, and Keir Starmer attends his first foreign summit as Prime Minister.
Plus a 10% drop. Morgan Stanley's Mike Wilson warns traders he sees an S&P 500 correction as highly likely before the US election.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
US President Joe Biden has not undergone any special neurological testing since his annual physical in February, according to his doctor. The statement comes after a barrage of questions from reporters about White House visitor logs showing a neurologist and Parkinson specialist visited the White House 8 times over the past year. Here's Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre's response.
Has the president been treated for Parkinson's? No. Is he being treated for Parkinson's? No, he's not. Is he taking medication for Parkinson's? No. So those are the things that I can give you full-blown answers on, but I'm not going to confirm a specialist, any specialist that comes to the White House out of privacy.
Jean-Pierre also said there are no plans for Biden to take another annual physical until after November's election. The questions dominated Monday's press briefing in a sign of how big an impact Biden's stilted debate performance has had on his hopes of retaining the White House. At least 9 House members have now called for Biden to step aside, and the House Democratic Caucus will meet Tuesday morning, which could lead to more defections.
Doubts over the US president's future are threatening to overshadow the NATO summit that begins today in Washington. Joe Biden is hosting the gathering, but other leaders, including Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz, are also facing pressure after recent elections in their countries. Support for Ukraine is a key issue on the agenda for the leaders. Former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko has urged the allies not to delay further help.
Don't trust Putin. And I know it from my own experience. This is a message for NATO. The attempt to delay the launching of negotiation with Ukraine is very dangerous.
Petro Poroshenko speaking there following Monday's Russian missile strike on a children's hospital in Kyiv. The current President Vladimir Zelensky has also called for greater resolve from allies in the wake of the attacks. NATO has agreed to spend at least 40 billion euros per year on military aid for Ukraine, but with the caveat that the target will be reviewed next year.
The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is one of the leaders travelling to NATO on his 5th day in the job. The UK is one of NATO's biggest spenders, and Starmer's new government wants to take a key role on the world stage. Bloomberg's James Wilcock has more.
When Keir Starmer won government in a landslide last week, he made the traditional international call.
Fortuitously, we will see each other next week. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you in Washington and having the opportunity, obviously, to sit down properly.
Our two countries are going to continue our special relationship. We're working together just about every issue, supporting Ukraine, managing the competition with China, advancing cooperation in the Indo-Pacific with AUKUS.
Starmer there talking to US President Joe Biden. British leaders often try and catch a bit of American stardust, but this time it may be Starmer, the progressive politician with a large, stable majority, who is in demand at the NATO summit. Yet the Labour leader's political honeymoon may prove short-lived as key allies see big shifts towards the right in coming months, with the spectre of a Donald Trump presidency looming. In London, James Wilcock, Bloomberg Radio.
Political shock in France is forcing bond investors to confront the country's fiscal deficit. President Macron's decision to call a snap election led the gap between French and German bond yields to widen the most since the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. Now, a hung parliament threatens to hinder any new government's ability to drive economic reforms. Ludovic Subran, chief economist at Allianz, says a coalition could complicate policy.
The left electoral alliance has now to ask really who they want to put forward as prime minister, the nominee, and then see how this person can work with the Macron's party in the parliament, right? And so that really means certainly an inflection of policies, but also a big standstill when it comes to big moves, reforms, and also certainly to consolidating our fiscal deficit.
Ludovic Supin from Allianz speaking there. Prior to the parliamentary elections, France had already been admonished by the EU for breaking the bloc's fiscal rules with the size of its budget deficit.
Morgan Stanley's chief US equity strategist Mike Wilson has warned of a stock market correction of 10% between now and the US presidential election is highly likely. As the S&P 500 opened the week at all-time highs, Wilson told Bloomberg that traders should brace for a pullback.
I think the chance of a 10% correction is highly likely sometime between now and the election. Not just because of the election, but because uncertainty is going to prevail for a lot of different reasons. Earnings reasons, election outcome reasons, some of the things you mentioned earlier around tariffs, potentially immigration, Fed policy still remains uncertain. So yeah, I think the third quarter typically is that period and it's going to be choppy.
Morgan Stanley's Mike Wilson there. He joins a rising number of Wall Street pros who are growing more cautious going into the third quarter, a seasonally turbulent period, particularly amid signs the US stock rally is overheating.
Jurors in the 8-week fraud trial of Bill Wong, the founder of Archegos Capital Management, are expected to begin deliberations on a verdict today. Bloomberg's Doug Krisner reports.
The case of Archegos Capital Management and its inability to meet billions of dollars in margin calls ensnared half of Wall Street, and it cost banks $10 billion. Huang is charged with 11 counts, including fraud and market manipulation. Yesterday, in closing remarks, Huang's lawyer said the government's case makes no sense because prosecutors failed to show how Huang planned to realize a windfall from the alleged scheme. In his closing, the prosecutor peppered his arguments with metaphors to show how Huang cared about moving stock prices, not acquiring stock. In New York, I'm Doug Krisner, Bloomberg Radio.
Well, let's go back to the latest from US politics now. President Joe Biden's doctor says that the president hasn't undergone any special neurological testing since his annual physical in February. This amid questions about the frequent visits to the White House of a Parkinson's specialist and mounting concern amid Democratic Party and donors about Biden's re-election campaign. Bloomberg TV anchor Kriti Gupta is with us for more on this story. Kriti, good morning. Why is there this speculation now, if you can just bring us up to speed, about the US president and Parkinson's disease?
So this has been in the water for a little bit now, and early signs of dementia, Alzheimer's, were floated by the media and by some of his critics as well. So this isn't necessarily new. I think what's new is the fact that this visitor log does in fact show that despite, and I believe you played the SOT at the beginning of the press secretary saying that he has not been consulted for it, the visitor logs do indeed show that the White House doctor has had that visit from the Parkinson's specialist. And so for that reason, the media has, of course, circulated that this may be a possibility. But that's where it's coming from. There still hasn't been much clarity on what that Parkinson's specialist was doing, or if it was even related to President Biden as opposed to other members of the staff or the family.
Yeah. What are, meanwhile, wealthy donors saying? Always important, obviously, in the US electoral system.
They are concerned. And I believe there was a group, some reporting, I want to say coming out of Archegos, that is talking about the likes of Larry Fink, for example, the head of Centerview Partners, for example, banding together and saying, is this really where we want to put our money? And remember, they're going up against some of the several billionaires who've backed President Trump as well. Steve Schwartzman is a great example of that. But they are concerned about whether that pool of money should indeed be behind President Biden or an alternate candidate. And they're simply meeting no major decisions have been made yet, no major kind of funding pull, but simply the fact that those conversations are being had by some of Wall Street's biggest names is fairly notable.
Kriti, what are the next steps in this story? There's a meeting of the House Democratic Caucus today. What should we be watching out for?
Well, there's a lot going on over the next few days, and the big one is going to be on July 11th. It's when the DNC Platform Committee meets in particular, and this is when the leadership of the party convention is going to be talking about what those next steps are. Remember, we are counting down the days towards a virtual roll call that will basically secure the presumptive nominee. But I think this is important, is that it's coming just days after President Biden, I believe in the last 24 hours, released a letter to his own party, a very public letter as well, outlining not only his policies, but making some very stark comments saying that this media speculation and this party speculation of him stepping down needs to stop. We need to be united to prevent Donald Trump from a 2.0. Though it was the verbatim from his from the letter that he circulated, whether or not that's actually carrying any weight is a big deal. And I should mention the latest, I think, voice to add to all of this is going to be Bernie Sanders. We know that he, of course, brings a big voice to the Democratic Party for international audience. He's far more left-leaning, very in touch with labor unions, etc. So it has tended, from a policy perspective, put a lot of pressure on the Democratic agenda, and of course the Biden agenda, not to mention the Clinton agenda before that. It is important as well, though, that he says that the best way to prove cognitive ability is to go out there, to meet the people, to do the press tours, etc. And you can see just in the last 24 hours an unsolicited appearance on MSNBC, followed by what, again, the campaign is calling aggressive travel schedule to try to make that point.
Yeah, absolutely. President Joe Biden telling MSNBC, I don't care what the millionaires think. You know, he was trying to make the point that he is running. He's not stepping back in any way. Our TV anchor, Kriti Gupta, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Well, amid the pressure on President Biden, he's hosting the leaders of 31 NATO countries for a 3-day summit in Washington. It's the 75th anniversary of the founding of the alliance amid the war in Ukraine and a push by President Zelensky to obtain more weapons from his allies. Let's bring in our EMEA News Director, Rosalind Matheson, for more. Ros, NATO seems to be fortifying itself ahead of this summit against the possibility of Donald Trump returning to the White House in November.
Well, that's right. So this NATO summit this week is a chance really for NATO to reset itself a bit and to present this idea of the alliance that is as strong and relevant as it was decades ago. But, as Kriti was just pointing out, we've got questions about, the distractions around some of the individual leaders. We've got real questions about what happens to NATO after the US election in November in the event of a second Donald Trump presidency, because, as you were saying, Donald Trump has been very dismissive of NATO. He's been very dismissive also of continued aid to Ukraine, and he's talked about, the US wouldn't actually defend certain member states within NATO unless they're pulling their weight financially, which goes against the very core of NATO, which is collective defense. Does that mean that NATO really is fragmented and falls apart? So there are fundamental questions about what the future US involvement might be in NATO and what NATO might look like in the coming years and decades. And against that backdrop, of course, of the US election campaign, which is really threatening to kind of drive the narrative around this meeting versus the broader questions around things like Ukraine and China.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what happens to Ukraine then? And if that is going to be the main focus of the summit today?
Well, what President Vladimir Zelensky is looking for, at least from the NATO summit, is a proper pledge that Ukraine can join NATO and a formal invitation to join NATO. And that's unlikely to come. What we're hearing is there might be some wording around general security guarantees and a future possibility of joining NATO, but not that magic card that Zelensky is looking for, and he'll be disappointed about that. So there'll be possibly more pledges for long-term aid for Ukraine out of this, but not that idea that Ukraine's going to get entree into NATO anytime soon. And of course, Ukraine would argue that that's necessary to give it that long-term buffer against Russia. So most of the conversation will be about the wording of how to suggest that Ukraine has a pathway to joining NATO at some point, but not yet that formal invitation.
What about the questions around defence spending, Ros? Is that going to be an issue that we could see some progress on?
Well, it's interesting because Donald Trump has, when he was president, did challenge NATO member states, saying they weren't contributing enough of their own budgets to their own defence and to the NATO defence. And there he actually did have a point, because a lot of countries in Europe have not been meeting those commitments, and some have now increased their defence spending, particularly again after Russia invaded Ukraine. But that's going to be an ongoing question as we look at some of the budgets across Europe in the coming years. And even in the UK, we've got Keir Starmer, the new leader, sort of questioning how much the UK can contribute, not just for its own defence, but also for the collective defence under NATO. So there'll be further conversation around that, of course, with the recent European parliamentary elections, with the right having done pretty well in the end. In the French election, for example, and in Germany, they're going to be willing to continue to allow this kind of defence spending. So big questions there also in the ether for that meeting.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.